Augmented Intelligence workshop. I'd first like to thank the National Science Foundation for supporting this workshop, and in particular, the program in the Science of Learning and Augmented Intelligence, and its presiding program officer, who is here with us, Dr. Susang Lim. Thanks very much. We've been excited to see a huge response from the workshop. So we have over 400 people registered for the workshop, representing 15 countries or more. We have 26 speakers slated to speak through the beginning of September, and we plan to have a second wave of speakers starting mid-September. So drop us a message nominating people who you would like to see present. So a quick rundown here of some of the workshop policies and infrastructures to help us collectively collaborate. Our workshop presentations and discussions will be recorded, and the recordings will be shared on a YouTube channel devoted to the workshop. So with that in mind, please mute your microphone unless you want your next door neighbor's loud argument to be forever immortalized on our channel. Please use the Zoom chat window to share your thoughts and questions. The chat log won't be recorded, and we're hoping that'll help lower your threshold for contributing your real-time thoughts. So after each of the two 25-minute talks today, we'll have short 4-minute Q&A period specifically for that talk. And after both of the talks, we'll have a longer and broader 30-minute discussion of topics related to the talks and inspired by the talks. So we're particularly interested in having wide and diverse participation in the workshop. And so we've leveraged several infrastructures to broaden participation, including the webpage, which many of you have already seen, archived presentations on YouTube, an email distribution list, scheduled days for open discussions. Marina Dubova, our workshop coordinator, who is here, she's set up a Slack channel, which we're hoping that you will use to make reading suggestions, to make comments. And she'll also archive jam boards that we collectively create during and after the workshops. So we have plans to write a series of workshop reports prepared by rapporteurs. Please let us know if there are other ways that we should consider trying to harness the collective intelligence that all of you are bringing to the table here. So I don't want to eat into Seth's and Kylie's presentations, but I did want to give a 2-minute overview about what this workshop is all about. So in a nutshell, we're interested in what makes people intelligent and how to make people and teams consisting of people and other things more intelligent. So I was trained as a traditional cognitive psychologist focused on perception, learning, memory, and problem solving, abilities of lab participants isolated in their own cubicles. However, this approach has very little resemblance to how we think in the real world. As argued by philosophers like Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers, minds are not restricted to the insides of human skulls. Minds leak out to include our bodies and our tools. Two particularly important ways in which our minds are extended is by our coordinations with other people and our coordinations with the machines that we purposely build exactly to help us think better and to connect better with others. So talk of augmenting intelligence often brings to people's minds neurotropic pharmaceuticals or brain implants. But we'd like to argue that focusing on these distant possibilities might lead us to ignore the immediately available ways in which our minds are already being massively extended by the social and the technical networks in which we inhabit. So our workshop organizing committee is Myrta Galisic, Gautam Biswas, Marina Dubova, and myself. And we have decided not to eat into speakers' presentations times by giving long biographies. Suffice it to say that they're all doing excellent state-of-the-science research on augmenting intelligence. So without further ado, I would like to invite Seth Frey to launch us into substantive content.
Substantive's a pretty high bar. I'll do my best. Hi, folks. My name is Seth Frey. I'm scrambling to get bingo. The right thing up. And we're all good. We are sharing. Hi, wonderful. So my name is Seth Frey. I'm a professor of communication at UC Davis. I enjoyed that spiel because it was the same kind of thing that got me astray under my unconventional cognitive science training from Rob, and more in the direction of groups of people rather than individuals. And so that's where I've ended up. You might almost call me a social scientist these days. And the work I'm presenting today is thanks to a couple NSF grants focused on some really cool cases of large-scale emergent self-governance and uniquely high, fine-grained, large-scale quantitative insights we can get out of that system. Now, my personal goal is using the affordances of actually online communities to improve the study of the comparative study of human social systems, such as self-governing systems. And I have a personal interest in self-governance and how people do it. And so that'll be on the theory and the research questions where I focus. But I do have some goals for you. There's thoughts I want you to think. One of them is that many cog-sci questions require not an individual unit of analysis, but a societal almost unit of analysis. And doing that means not comparing lots of individuals, but comparing lots of societies, getting lots of social systems, and bringing each of them into the lab. And that I want you to think that we shouldn't shy away from this, and I want you to think that's actually not as hard as you think. So why should a cognitive scientist study groups instead of individuals? Why is that an important unit of analysis? Well, I'm going to argue. So these are two, kind of things a cognitive scientist could credibly study, right? Individuals are susceptible to social influence, and the accumulated effects of social influence matter. Let's say social influence is important. And I could imagine lab studies that get at both of those, one focused on the existence of effect and one getting into effect size, for example. But if we really dive in, if we really think about what we mean by social influence, of course, you can imagine we're looking at how it ripples through a social system. And so so the second question, to get at it in its core, in its essence, why does X matter outside of a brain? Suddenly, we need to see it ripple through we need to see it ripple through a social system lots of times. Our unit of analysis has become the group. That's harder. It's traditionally observational centered because you basically have to lose control in order to get enough social systems to have independent trials of a rippling through society. Nevertheless, that's my first thesis, that question, as much
Seth,
as, yeah?
It looks like we're stuck on your introductory slide.
Really?
Maybe you need to.
Embarrassing.
Yeah, I didn't realize. Thanks, Kylie, for pointing it out.
Yeah, we've got it might be a desktop, but it's a beautiful picture of a city. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's my pre-slide. Okay, I'm gonna stop and start again. My screen sharing is paused. That's a nice notice. I'm being informed.
Sorry, Seth, but we know how this all happens.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Start again. Boop. Beep. And now?
Great.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So things I want you to think. Okay, so showing the social influence, people are susceptible to it, individual level, but seeing how it ripples through society, group level, which means lots of societies in the lab to watch it ripple through lots of times. Thus, we have an example of a legitimate individual scale question, a legitimate question about humans being a fundamentally group unit of analysis question. Now, because group scale is so much harder, we're kind of used to thinking that it's not really practically possible to do, but we can do better now. And so it's important not to be restrained to the possible at the expense of the necessary. Once new things are if we're not staying fresh on what's now possible. And online communities make large and group scale social science possible, available to us. So I'm going, a really good example is going to be the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who I was influenced by at Indiana University. She gave fundamental insights into how people self-govern small scale natural resource systems such as pastures and fisheries and so on. And if you know anything about her work, things like she was famous for the 10 design principles. All the big things we got out of her were because she did a lot of legwork, comparing 300 self-governing common pool resource systems in a meta-analysis, and 200 irrigation systems in Nepal, and 80 self-managed forest systems all around the world. So the fundamental method behind her contributions to the science of self-governance was large and comparative analysis at the unit of the social system. She did it on the ground. And so by her standards, she got into the hundreds, and by the standards of what we're used to, hundreds is gigantic, really a lot of work. But with online communities and by the standards of what's necessary, by really, by the standards of what we need, hundreds is tiny, tens is tiny, and we need to get into the thousands or hundreds of thousands. So with all of that, I'm going to get into some little tiny common pool resource systems. Trees go down, cities go up, that we can study in the thousands and hundreds of thousands. This is a screenshot of the video game Minecraft. It's a little old now. I'm going to start off with some kind of fun work from about 2016, where people create a little virtual world that has resources that are finite, and they have to figure out how to share and manage them together. And this is going to be our little toy laboratory for looking at the emergence of self-governance in thousands of systems. So, that is an example of the tragedy of the commons, which represents every major dilemma facing humanity at the global scale, and also manifests in collective action problems are all over the internet. And so we get a nice microcosm of the fundamental problem of collective action problems. And that's, again, for the toy study of these things. And the fundamental characteristic that I'm honing in on when I talk about doing societal unit of analysis research is engineered social systems. They're actually great. So think sports, think games, think theme parks, think in my case, online communities. Anything characterized by a simplified environment with clear goals and high motivation. That they provide structured data. They're often engineered for one purpose, which means they often suggest a research question. They have lots of data at very high granularity. They have selection on performance when they're selected for. If they're constantly popping up and disappearing, then there's an evolutionary process that we can keep an eye on. And again, we get that societal unit of analysis. If you're worried about online, it's a video game, so what can we learn about human beings? That's if you're comparing to ethnography. Minecraft is not the real world. But if you can compare it to the lab, it's a very poorly controlled lab environment with slightly less unreal people of more kinds, and so it fits, I think, as a method in the library of methods we use to study people. And so the domains I've gotten myself into are this video game Minecraft, which has lots of instances. Reddit is a forum community I'm active in. Open source software communities. Every open source project is its own little social system that we can now compare lots of on, say, GitHub. There's one English edition Wikipedia, but there's hundreds of language editions and so on. Twitter, I'm going to consider large N at the unit of individuals and N of 1 at the unit of the social system. Facebook, also, I'm going to consider large N at the unit of individuals and N equals 1. So these are not appropriate, those two domains, for the kind of work I'm interested in. And so let's dive into this specific study. What are some neat things that you can get at if you study the emergence of how kids learn to design governance systems to manage resources on their own? You can kind of see us falsifying Lord of the Flies, like it's our only political theory about whether kids can self-govern. There's also folk theory of utopia, which is going to be, what's the naive set of rules that a person thinks other people will, respond to? What's the what's our naive sense of what leads to successful collective action before we do it? It's a nice domain. Oh yeah, I think learning to lead is a nice one. Again, like if these are young people or inexperienced people, what's the difference between the very first social governance system they defined for their community and the one they ended up with that ended up working? What's the delta there? So this is an example of what Minecraft looks like. There's a big world, it goes off infinitely in every direction. There's an administrator and there's lots of users. They build cool stuff together. So not only do we have resource management problems, we have what you call public good provisioning problems, which is how do we, if anyone can enjoy this thing, how do you incentivize people to do the work, the boring work of building it? Another thing that's special about Minecraft in particular is typical hosting, there's computers owned by a company, and then there's little dots people log into that single computer. What's special thing about the video game of Minecraft specifically, and this is why I study Minecraft, it's not because of anything else. It's because of this weird backend property that it was designed to be self-hosted. It was designed that people around the world, that you buy the game as a client, but the server is free. So anyone can start this world. And then people compete with each other for users. And it created a very vibrant ecosystem because everyone was creating and modifying their own servers and governing their own servers. So these are the names of plugins that you can install. Governance has been reduced to a bunch of little modules. So your governance of your social system is going to be this, picking from an a la carte menu, essentially. I want a little bit of communication rules and I want prevention of bad behavior rather than remediation of bad behavior. I want social hierarchy. I want private property rights versus some public property management regime. And so you just kind of pick, and I can scrape hundreds of thousands of communities to figure out which switches they flipped, what plugins they installed, what meal they put together from the buffet in terms of how they specifically are going to govern their set of collective action problems. Scanning 300,000 servers, 50 million visits by 10 million players over 2 years, we're able to build a nice data set and come up with some insights. How done time? Can I get a 10 check that? Let me interpret this plot for you. What we've got on the x-axis is the target size of the community. An administrator can say, I want my community to be 4 people. I want my community to be 200 people. If we collapse those boxes down onto the x-axis, we see that most people are in this column. Most people want a community of 4 to 16. This is the maximum number of people who can be logged in simultaneously. Okay, and now if we collapse onto Y, we'll get core group size, which I defined as the number of people who visit at least once a week for a month. And we're going to call that success. So success is succeeding at getting a core group, a group of people who keep coming back at least once a week, even though they could be going to any other of 100,000 communities. If they come back to yours for a month, then you succeeded. And of course, this white is blank because you can't have more people regularly coming back than you kind of designed to be permissible on the system at the same time, more or less. And now if we collapse onto Y, we'll see that most communities fail to get 0 or 1, more than 0 or 1 people. The 1 could be the administrator themselves. And so it's only this upper triangle that we're going to define as success. In particular, it's this upper diagonal we'll define as success. The communities that hit their own personal target maximum. And we're going to be looking at the predictors in terms of governance plugin, governance style of hitting, more or less this upper diagonal. Great. And so what I did was I looked at the types of problems a plugin can solve. It can solve the problem of virtual resources, physical resources like CPU, RAM, bandwidth. Actual physical resources have to be successfully managed. Paying for the server. There are plugins that help you raise money from your users. There are plugins that help you reduce CPU bandwidth by controlling how many sheep you can grow. You know, and this happened, and it turns out from these results that plugins that manage bad behavior are a predictor of size. That's just going to the right. Plugins that manage physical resources correlate positively with size, but also with the upper diagonal, with the interaction of size and success. Virtual resource management actually doesn't seem to matter very much, although you do see more of it in the largest and most successful communities in this upper corner. So that's the problems. And then on the bottom, we have styles of governance. You can solve a governance problem by improving peer-to-peer communication, top-down information, resource exchange, like installing markets, or by further empowering an already strong administrator, increasing the delta between the list of actions a user can perform and then the administrator can perform. And you see that as a significant predictor of size, that there's a lot more top-down as you get larger. I was really interested in what kind of democracy and user participation I would find on Minecraft, and I didn't find much. It's very, very dictator focused. And the closest you get to anything like choice is the freedom to exit with your feet and impose through market pressure some kind of democratic values on the administrators who get exited from a lot. Just counting the number of rules, we find more rules leads to larger, more is correlated with larger and more successful communities. I'm doing a causal story, so sorry, you can judge me for it. And institutional diversity can be measured in a couple ways, and basically just there's a variety in the problems. So this is the sort of, let's call it the entropy over the types of resource challenges you face on the left, and variety in the types of resource solutions of governance solutions used, that bottom row of communication exchange administrator. And diversity also correlates certainly positively with size of both types. And depending how you interpret my regression, it correlates positively or negatively with success. Yeah, there's a bunch of other work that's popped out of this. We were able to ask, looking at traffic between communities, we're able to we noticed that communities that are governed similarly tend to have the same type of people trafficking between them. We're able to do a nice little causal study using complex network methods to ask what causes what. Our evidence is that communities that govern themselves with similar types of rules are more likely to attract similar users. In another offshoot project, we use price equation to look at is governance change due to selection versus just random evolutionary drift? And we find fairly strong evidence for at least some types of plugin, particularly the administrator plugins, that there's active selection on governance style as communities compete with each other for users. Branching out of Minecraft, there's a little bit on Reddit I've been getting into. This is the grant funded work. Here are written rules that a lot of types of communities use. So we have teens support teens as a peer support discussion forum on Reddit, and these are the written rules of that community. Some of them are no suicide and self-harm related posts, so this is some heavy stuff. Whereas shower thoughts is a sort of hilarious Reddit. All posts must be shower thoughts. A shower thought is not a thought about being in the shower. So these written rules are amenable to automated text analysis. And so we have some tools decomposing text into institutional kind of abstractions so that we can extract representations of the governance structure of subreddits and other text-driven environments into, to then, of course, compare their governance structure from institutional structure extracted from text. We find some stuff. We're able to compare across platforms, Minecraft compared to Reddit, compared to WoW, and similarities in how they scale on the number of rules per community. Similarities in governance style across platforms, and overwhelming reliance on what we call norms rather than rules, which is rules that don't have an explicit punishment. That's on the top row. On the bottom row, a focus much more on behavioral regulation rather than defining abstract construct. There shall be a Congress is what I would call a constitutive rule versus don't do this, I would call a regulatory rule. The takeaway here is going to be that overall communities are using rules more to set expectations about good behavior rather than engineer some incentive system. So think more soft rather than strict nudges. And yeah, so let's see, work on the Apache Foundation because there are a lot of open source projects. So these are another example of the type of environment we can dig into and do large and comparative analysis. Each of those is a software project that we can compare with a lot of, and we have all their code because they're open source, and all their chat, all their discussion because they're open values. This work is coming out of the institutionalgrammar.org, Institutional Grammar Research Initiative with my colleagues there, and the Meta Governance Project with my colleagues there. I don't know what my time was. I just sort of talked until there's nothing else to talk about. My goal was to get into individual governance decisions, individual decisions about the design of self-governing systems for yourself, with a focus on online communities. And hopefully you now think, even though these particular research questions were not so cognitive, that there are cognitive science questions that are fundamentally social unit of analysis, that we shouldn't shy away from that, and that's not as hard as it seems when we can look at online communities. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. So we will have some specific questions on your talk before we enter a broader conversation. And I saw somebody did have their hand raised. Gabriella?
Yes, thank you. My question was, you mentioned the World of Warcraft and you kind of posited it against Minecraft. So I'm interested in what you've noticed as far as trends in the self-governance styles based on a game that's more mission driven like World of Warcraft versus a game that's a little less mission driven. It's more like a community gathering space in Minecraft. So are there certain trends in gaming self-governance in these type of systems where one is really focused on getting as many people together as you can to raid or to go into dungeons versus getting people to farm and grow things that isn't necessarily for the outcome of like a legendary item? Are there trends in that self-governance that you've noticed?
They're certainly run very differently. Minecraft governance, there are written rules. If you log on to a community, you'll see there's signs that get, the place you enter the world will be peppered with signs that have really short text snippets. Don't do this, don't step on the grass. But more of governance is encoded into plugins that add functionality to the basic community server. Whereas my World of Warcraft is a lot of written rules, and it is like 20-page rule documents. So they have gigantic rule systems, and it's really detailed. And so the servers are a lot larger. They get into the thousands of people. So the primary, like the games are very different, and I'm sure that accounts for differences in governance style. Certainly differences in what's being governed, right? There's probably a lot more focus on bad behavior rather than managing CPU. But the elephant in the room is going to be the size of the community, that you have to write a rule system for 5,000, and that's going to be very different than a rule system for 5. It'll probably be a lot more impersonal and a lot more thorough. Nevertheless, I don't want to make generalizations because so we're asking a question this is n equals 2, and I want to get into n equal hundreds or thousands. So I would want not just my comparisons within a platform to be in the hundreds or thousands. So I would love to get to a point where I can do a large scale comparison of platforms and get hundreds of them to come up with these generalizations in a way that we trust and feel comfortable with, to abstract over the specifics of World of Warcraft and get into large N versus small N communities generally, or goal-oriented or conflict-oriented versus open-ended or cooperation-focused environments, and so on. Does that address your question?
Yes, thank you. I was just curious about that because, I have familiarity with both of these platforms, and in World of Warcraft, they can be so huge, but within one server, you can have, let's say, a guild that has 1,000 members and another guild that has 500 and another guild that has 10, and they're all doing something and they all have their own rules within the guild as well as with what's on the server, and they all have separate plugins, and it's just drilling down to the style of self-governance. I was curious about how that was comparing from one to the other, because the complexity gets to be really sticky.
Yeah, which is why I didn't get into World of Warcraft. That thing is a zoo. Yeah, you're totally right. There are these governance units at the level. I'm so glad you know about these games. This is really fun. I hope we get to talk more. There are guilds where people self-organize into small cooperative groups. I couldn't scrape their rules. I couldn't scrape their governance. I can't figure out what governance tools they use because their plugins are client side rather than server side. When I looked at World of Warcraft, I looked at the private server ecosystem. So fans stole the game, re-implemented it on their own, just rewrote World of Warcraft and privately host the entire game on their own computers. And so my data is from that ecosystem, which only numbers in the low, like 50s. Like there's about 50 of these self-hosted private pirate editions of the game of World of Warcraft. And my analysis was on those. I didn't get into guilds, no data. Got to go where the data is.
So let's ask just one more question for Seth particular, and then we can revisit some of these issues. So Edgar.
Hello, good morning to everyone. So Seth, there is this like a kind of new trend talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, which is popularized by Facebook company Metaverse. What do you think will be the implications for collective intelligence within the Metaverse?
Oh, I like being treated as someone who has informative thoughts about these things, but it's all a lie. I'm in the spectrum. There's a certain type of tech researcher who's the early adopter. There's another type of tech researcher who's kind of the Luddite. I fit more in the Luddite category. I have yet to see how how virtual reality, in particular, is more than a 3D version of the 2D screen, how it's as a medium, it does fundamentally different things, where they're on immersiveness, but not other things. So I'm not yet thinking about it in non-familiar terms. I'm not yet thinking about it outside of what I think about from my two-dimensional screen right now. So that's sort of a non-answer. And please prove me wrong. I can't wait to be wrong.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Seth, for the great talk and for kicking us all off. Our second speaker is going to be Kylie Peppler, also located in California.
Yes, thank you, Rob. And also a former student of Rob's as well. So there's always an IU connection, isn't there? I was in your undergraduate courses, Rob. So, today I want to build on some of the themes that both Rob and Seth have brought to the table around sort of the complexity of the learning environment, the social aspects of the learning environment. How do we start to frame AI given those complexities? Because the low-hanging fruit, sort of the behaviorists, sort of especially in educational landscapes, the flashcards, the apps where they're helping you to memorize kinds of things, that's pretty easy to build. But how do we start to build technologies that really embrace sort of what we would view as the best of education? And so I'm a professor of both informatics and education, situated here at UC Irvine. And I also direct a lab called the Creativity Labs. So within that, I start to bring a unique perspective into this landscape, because it's not just that I sit between these two schools and think about the design of ed tech, but I also bring this sort of unique learning sciences lens that I want to share with you today, and some of the new methodologies too that we're honing to help get some of these great ideas that many of you and many of our speaker series out of the academic institutions and influencing the game space, the sort of the ed tech industry writ large. And oftentimes we're looking at these things and we're like, well, do they do them well? Do they not do them well? And where do they score high or low? But how do we start to design with these partners in mind? And so today I want to kind of share those methods, but also kind of a sample case project that we have been studying around the introduction of AI into classrooms. It's been pretty fun. We just got off the list there. All right. So these are a sampling of the kind of the industry and nonprofit partners that we've been working with lately. I'm going to zoom us into sort of the recent partnership with both Digital Promise and Merlin Mind. But I've had the good fortune of working with several. So as we think about sort of this AI and education, I am the rapporteur for education, the education beat. So in particular, if you have any folks that are in the education sphere, and Seth, I would include your work as well in that beat. So it could be kind of more ethnographic kind of studies that Seth has been doing to other AI and education work like Cindy Jimenez Silvers, who will be coming up recently. I'd love to get those names to kind of inform that work as well. But within AI and education, there's a lot of promise and not a lot of action in the space. So we've got things sort of creating new kinds of assessments, new insight to what might happen with a learner or a group of learners, such as like a predictive analytics or a smart suggestions kind of platform. We've got other promise of thinking about supporting collaboration or different kinds of rule sets or ways that we can kind of augment sort of classroom learning in this way. And then this last problem here in particular on tackling complex problems, that's where I'm going to focus today with that the sample case study here, where we've been working with folks to kind of create a new classroom orchestration technology. But can we move people effectively from small group to whole group to individual work? Can we start to untether teachers from the screen at the front of the classroom where they need to press the buttons to be able to be immersed into the classroom and so forth? And so with all of that, we need to start to think about how we design our AI. And AI, the artificial intelligence, I love that we're using augmented intelligence, but all of this intelligence, it is an artifact that's reflected by our own perspectives on the world, right? The designer of these things, the designers of these Minecraft worlds, the designers of these AI, it comes with us, our particular perspective. And so within that, we have to really kind of take a stance on what is the kind of environment, what are the kind of guiding theories that we want to imbue into that. And I would even say, some of the stuff that Seth just shared, a lot of those designers in Minecraft communities aren't even cognizant that they're thinking about solving problems, but they probably aren't even thinking about the kinds of societies as a more philosophical question that they're embarking on. So I want to just kind of share, not all of us are learning scientists, of course. And so I just want to kind of give you a little brief background into sort of what this the science of learning is all about. And so within the learning sciences, that we view guiding theory as important to design. So that's essential that we use both the theory to design something, but we also then use the design to contribute back to theory. And so particularly as we think about new AI kinds of technologies, how do we want them to imbue more complex theories of learning that are social, that are distributed in nature, that kind of start to take on those complexities. And we want to kind of avoid kind of falling back to behaviorist approaches to education, kind of like automatic flashcards, adaptive assessment, behavioral management tools, things like that, that are kind of low-hanging fruit. And this is where, the standardized testing conversations, a lot of this where you have to memorize and drill and kill the teach to the test kind of portions, they all fall back on this because it is the easiest to design, right? But from my point of view, I come from a social, cultural, and constructionist point of view. I was on the original design and study team for the Scratch platform that now has I think close to 400 million users worldwide. And how do we start to design for these kind of complexities? And central to that belief is around that we need to make and share artifacts as being particularly important for our learning process. So I'm looking for technologies that'll support complex and social environments, similar kind of things that Seth is looking for as well. Sort of project-based learning, no simple or known solutions. So that's kind of hard. From AI, we've got to kind of start to create a very complex algorithm that can start to approximate how human assessors would operate. And we also want environments that have a heavy use of new technologies. We really think we can design new technologies in the right way to start to shift what the learner can do and engage them in really big and powerful ideas. So within the learning sciences, we have new methodologies. And these methodologies, I just want to highlight sort of the design-based research. And so these cycles of research that we go in is we come at it from a theoretical standpoint, right, to create a first and localized design that works there. And this could be a paper prototype. This could be something really small. If you're into modeling learning environments, this could be just something that has your basic kind of MVP functions. And then you implement it, you analyze the data, if there's any implications for theory kind of coming out, but then also in that redesign, we kind of go through those cycles several times through. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're using this to actually start to create some of the new AI technologies. And then furthermore, it's not, the context matters, right? And so just like the Seth was alluding to the context of each one of these, the ends of ones of these gaming or social spaces or Reddit, within education, we started thinking about context and having deeper relationships with our partners. And so there's a whole line of work around research practice partnerships. And this is to get us out of laboratories and into real world and messy context, but also, we're not going to fly by night. These are long-term kind of relationships that we're building with our collaborators to kind of bring researchers and practitioners together. All of this is around identifying a core problem of practice. We shouldn't just, in educational research, we're not trying anymore just to do something in the ivory tower that advances research, but we want to kind of find something that advances research that also advances a real world problem, right? That would be of interest to the local schools, the out of school communities, society writ large, right? And so, methodologically within those RPP cycles, a lot of times we start with practical measures, so formative feedback, that kind of thing that helps us to hone that partnership and that design over time. So what I've been doing is sort of thinking about, and this is, if you do work for the National Science Foundation or any real federal funder or folks, we're in, especially in higher education, we sit in a silo, right? We don't, a lot of times we're not working with practitioners or our nonprofit partners out in the real world, but we're also not working with our industry partners. And so, especially in the learning sciences, we're like, oh my God, they made that mistake again. If only they knew about the learning sciences, they wouldn't have done that same old problem, right? And so, but how do we actually invite industry partners into the fold? My graduate students are like, oh my gosh, does that mean I have to just write a report that makes them super happy and I can't do authentic research? So how do we start to navigate this complicated infrastructure? And so what we've been doing is kind of adding, a third bubble to those RPPs to really think about RPIPs, right? So research practice industry partners. So we can get us out of something that's this innovation that's happening in academia, and how do we get to scale pretty quickly? And we've had a lot of luck doing that. And so that's where I feel like I need to share my kind of approach with all of you, but also just with the field more broadly. And this is, we've got kind of three groups that are siloed apart. You've got practitioners and educators that are in classrooms that they want to be heard in the development process, and they talk a lot, but there's no way to get that feedback or ideas out to the research world or into the industry world. They just don't have any direct line to there. And so they're really victims of the next ed tech technology that's being sold to their administrator and then falls into their classroom. And so that, it becomes this whole problematic. At the same time, you see industry professionals, they're making strong products, maybe they're having a lot of market failures, but they don't necessarily connect that to a real problem of practice or build on any of the prior research or theory, right? And so, and researchers, again, we have all these ideas that are getting stuck and siloed in academia that maybe are written up nicely in research papers, but haven't been, challenged to really start to understand sort of the industry barriers to making that grow. I know my dad was an engineer, and he had this great idea for a television, and it was very efficient and yada yada, but it wasn't scalable because what the resources that were needed to actually build this television just really could not be done at scale, right? And so you can have great ideas, but until you kind of start to intersect it with the realities of the real world, we don't know whether that can actually scale. So this is actually an important set of three partners we bring to the table. And I want to set, if you don't work with industry partners often, I kind of like this curve so that I can kind of introduce you to their process a little bit more closely. But you can kind of see, it's not a straight linear curve, and a lot of folks fail in the startup periods here. But in general, most companies are moving between, especially the new product, is having a vision and mission for a new product, right? And a lot of times we have really strong vision and mission. And then they get to an MVP, a minimum viable product that would satisfy the customer needs, right? And then thinking about product market fit, right? So kind of getting ready to scale, like, is there a need for this product? Is there a desire? Is there actually even a funding stream that could support this product? So that middle stage is that. And then the scaling of that product and having a good sort of marketing team, that end of the scale, that has no interest to me, in academia, although some people study these things as well. But I'm more interested in sort of the early design and development. But oftentimes when I work with partners, they assess themselves right here. They've got they've got a product. They're like, I'm just about ready to scale. Let's just take this baby and blow it up. And I want to sell to the whole state of New York, right? And when we come to work together, I'm in that difficult position of telling them, actually, they're still in mission and vision, right? They probably got a really good slide deck. It feels really compelling. They thought through a lot of the core logic, and you could feel it. But the technology isn't necessarily imbuing that. And so there's this kind of gap that exists right there. So how do we help get them, kind of moving throughout that pipeline, and what can we bring to the table as researchers? And I hope to excite all of you about this process and kind of thinking through that. But a lot of times we start working with partners, they don't have a research team. They don't even have access to our readings because they're blinded. So kind of creating a set of shared readings, terms, prior findings, even frameworks for that work. We also need to work on quick turnarounds, right? So, instead of 2 to 3 years, like a typical National Science Foundation grant, we got to work in having quicker sprints that'll kind of get us some information within, every 2 to 3 months or so. And we can sort of learn from end user design partners like IDEO or the Stanford D School on how to do this and iterate quickly and well. And maybe some of that has also influenced some of your work as well. And I think, as a researcher, there's ethical issues that we want to think about, right? We want to think about being a truth third-party objective stance. We're not being paid to just rubber stamp those technologies and get them to market, but we really want to interrogate and push the team, both the product, but also the process, right? So the product is not just the tech that they're releasing, but their customer support, their onboarding, their professional development, all of those things. And we want to iterate on all of those levels and do that well. And it's definitely uncomfortable. Almost always I have to tell partners that they're not ready to deploy when they think they're ready. And so they hate me at first, but then they love me in the end, right? So we could get these things comfortably deployed. And then we want to, you have to work across the company. So you got to be able to talk to their tech team, their sales teams, their marketing teams, even their leadership on why this research is going to help them, right? And we have to think creatively on the research side. I have a whole graduate team. How do we kind of create publications and academic products that hold that same rigor, but not, maybe sometimes they're journals, or maybe sometimes there's things that build strategically towards larger journal articles, right? All right, so I want to get into this case study of a new tech that we've been developing together with Merlin Mind, and so you can Google them should you wish, but also with Digital Promise. And so this is a new product called Symphony Classroom. It's an AI classroom hub that combines hardware, AI services, and software to support teachers in their classrooms. And so Symphony Classroom uses Merlin, the world's first digital assistant designed specifically for teachers. And the technology is designed to reduce overall frustration and help teachers, or it was intended to design to do these things, help teachers navigate all of the tech in their classrooms. There's so many pieces of hardware, so many pieces of software, just even that kind of that movement, all of these things should hypothetically help learners, but even just turning something on, turning something off, moving from these things, going to small laptops, moving to the front of the room. We don't have good ways to sort of move between that and to really support the teachers in doing that. And so, so they've added different things like setting timers for activities to help the students kind of pace. They've added, ability to kind of switch, there's multiple dongles that can kind of go into there. And so they can switch between, kind of their overhead document cam and that through this little voice remote, all sorts of new, working order. And so I'm kind of thinking about our PIPs as kind of having phases. And this first phase is really moving them out of a vision and mission to an MVP. And this is more of a qualitative phase where we work in case studies to kind of generate personas. We have rapid report development, all of these bug reports. We want to get back to the development teams. And really, just like in a normal DBR learning sciences cycle, or even in your normal grant cycle, a lot of that is on the development. We got to have it there to study, right? And so it's not really about the theory or the external publications. And so, that's kind of safe for both the academics. You can't publish things that don't contribute to real, knowledge, but also, when somebody doesn't get something right, they don't want that to be the front page news either, right? So in this particular one, we were talking with the teachers and we're talking, looking at what the current research held and the industry needs. It's kind of looking, particularly the problems of the pandemic. And the key opportunity here was to look at, could a device like Symphony Classroom help with the overall techno stress, which is very high. Think about, Zoom, hybrid teaching, all of these things that are just huge stressors on our lives. And also time savings, spending more time on teaching and learning. So as we move from these, the second phase here, we started thinking about how can we get them out of an MVP once we have it there to more evidence of product market fit. That would obviously help sales, but also, then they can launch in confidence to kind of know that this actually solves a real world problem, that we're not just trying to sell, bad ed tech on the market. At this point, we can start to use quasi-experimental methods. We can have a greater emphasis on the DBR and those kinds of things as well. And you could imagine a third phase that would help with the scaling and more DBIR cycles that would be more experimental methods across a variety of contexts. So in this particular study, we were in a North Carolina public school district. We had a small treatment and control group. Very hard. We were in the Omicron outbreak doing all this. So we launched right before it started in November, and we had a post-test right in the middle of the Omicron outbreak. So that kind of sets the piece here. And what we did is we wanted to look at the second phase at some place that we're not doing the teacher onboarding or the training, just somewhere that they're already at. Can we see how Symphony Classroom is being deployed across a variety of contexts? And we had looked at two big things, Techno Stress and then this time savings, but we also had these system usability measures as well. And Techno Stress, if you don't know about it, it is a term that's been widely used in industry and government work, but it's a stress that's produced by technology tools and processes that's instrumental to job success, productivity, and satisfaction. I'm betting everybody on this call has Techno Stress on some level, right? But we don't use this often in educational settings, but we did find an instrument that we could use and harness for this study. And what we found over that 7-week period is 2/3, close to 2/3 of the users reported an overall reduction of techno stress. This is after introducing yet another technology. I was kind of surprised to see that, right? And in the worst of times, not the best of times. And then we also saw that it was being decreased about a little over 14% just in that period. So this isn't over a year, it's just in that initial 7-week, 2-month kind of startup period right over the holidays. Moreover, we kind of found some significant effects on 5 of these measures. And so you can look at here, but kind of the things we were talking about before of teachers being fear that they're going to be outmoded by techno stress and so forth. And the work performance was actually kind of interesting because the control group actually took this huge fall on their work performance, and we saw no negative impact on overall work performance in our reported performance by our teacher group. We also had, some interesting findings. We were using this kind of well-known Talus instrument to look at time savings and efficiency as well. And here is where you start to see significantly more time spent on teaching and learning in our treatment group. And this is a very small n, so this is a very large effect size here, and significantly less time spent on administrative tasks. But you can also see these kind of moderating impacts here, is that because they could spend more time on teaching and learning and more time kind of going through the classroom, you saw discipline not being impacted, right? Whereas teachers that were getting distracted in our control classrooms, the same schools, and had, still not having any support on managing technology, having a lot of trouble maintaining discipline. So I hope that I am inspiring you today to kind of really start to think about a few key things. Like, how can you start to bring in, many of us are designing technologies. How can you start to bring in industry partners to help you rapidly deploy some of your early findings and research, into real world settings? This is going to mean radically shifting our research as well as our industry development practices on many, many levels. With this particular technology, it's a really nice demonstration project about how we can start to see AI introduced in the classroom in ways that, that can augment teaching without threatening teachers. They're very worried about getting replaced by AI and not being supported by these. So I love this augmented intelligence strand. I think it speaks to the education space particularly well. And then, with this, it's the first time I think we've been able to really document positive impacts about having this real-time assistant, AI assistant, to decrease administrative tasks significantly, reduce techno stress over time, scaffold effective teaching practices, and sort of the things that people were able to do with that extra time. For research, we start to have some inroads there too. But for ed tech development, this does mean they have to start to work in new ways. The companies we work with are brave, they're ambitious. I mean, they're building a radically different kind of company with whole different wings and sectors of the company than what you'd normally have. To build closely on the research literature, to work closely with the teachers, and really making a stance on how we can bring high quality learning to life. So anyway, I'm excited for your questions. Please stay in touch. This is my email and my Twitter handle and so forth. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kylie. That was a great whirlwind talk. So I think maybe we can get Project to ask their question in person, because they made an interesting question about Techno Stress in the chat.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering about, I was thinking about novelty effect when you were talking about introducing the mind, sorry, did I forget the name? Symphony Mind, was it right? To the classroom. And I've been involved in some work that looked at novelty effect and tried to sort of track it longitudinally, whether it recedes after a while, but we didn't have enough time to go that longitudinal. So I was just wondering if you could, if you have any thoughts about the wow turning into the stress of having that technology now introduced to your classroom and integrated perhaps for a long time.
Yeah, it's hard because, a lot of times we think about in education, like how long till you get a positive effect, right? And, just because of a lot of different factors, the 7-week period was just sort of what worked for schools, what worked for the company, what worked for us, to kind of do that. And I was really afraid it was going to be too short of a time period, right? So we want to look at these dosage effects. So this is hot off the presses. I'm excited to share this with all of you, but we don't have any sort of long-term sense of dosage. But I was excited to see these results so early in the process. In general, and in our early pilots too, when a product isn't working that well and they do go out to the market, it causes a lot of stress because they're not, it's not invisible in the context. There's a lot of on-ramping professional development startup costs, especially to pivot teachers in the middle of a school year. That's a very hard market to operate in. So it's exciting, it's that kind of outcome is exciting to kind of see a reduction in that techno stress when you add yet another thing, right? And many of us, that's what we're trying to do in the ed tech atmosphere, is another app, another workflow, another this, but not really how can we help people navigate the things that are already working for them a little bit better.
Perhaps the nature of stress is also very different for different people and different categories of collaborators.
Yeah, I know. We're just really like touching the surface of this. So, and it's a very, very new area and definitely not studied with teachers, but everyone here has probably seen the newspaper headlines. The teaching industry has been hit hard and stress is a big, big factor. Yes, Christina.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie. I just wanted to ask a question that kind of ties Seth's and your presentations together. I've been really interested in self-governance and self-organization myself. I have a 13-year-old who really struggles against the kind of hierarchical assumptions about school that are made. And I'm wondering if there is cross-pollination in the learning tech, in the development of learning tech, that takes into account maybe more bottom-up governance structures or habits, because I see so many facilitated processes in adult groups that are about rounds, about consent, and a lot of the teaching paradigms are still very, teacher at the front of the room. Thank you.
Yeah, and Christina, I'd be interested to hear what Seth has to say on this too. But the what I'm excited about is if we can do these design projects, right, where you're creating these pieces. What I really believe we can do is use AI to scaffold that learning experience, right? What we're seeing is teachers, maybe not even by choice, but they're kind of rendered, so one of the things we know about good teaching is just to move around the room, see what the kids are doing, kind of ask them probing questions, get them feedback, even just to manage a group of people. It's important that you're not standing in the corner because, the group in the back is not going to feel as engaged, right? So just by scaffolding that and freeing the teacher from that device that has to be physically tethered to the front of the room, now all of a sudden they can move around, right? So so teachers that have never been able to do that before, all of a sudden are starting to try different managerial studies. Our teachers are reporting that they're posing significantly more questions that don't have a clear answer. So you can start to take those sort of risks and start to not have that top-down structure in classrooms if we start to scaffold that teaching. And again, this is very alpha beta prototypes on what we might be able to do in classrooms with AI. But what we can do is start to take teaching practices that might have really just gone the way they did, because a lot of the way we've designed classrooms gets them to do those top-down structures. And you heard Seth kind of say, the larger the community, the more top-down you have to be, unless you have that support, right? And so the AI there in both communities, you're starting to see that support, and then what can they do with that, right? That's the exciting part. And I think we can start to open it up, across the two projects. And maybe Seth, you want to kind of respond to that. Maybe you've started to see any additional add-ons there.
I'm happy to chime in. Nia, I think you're onto something, saving this for the integrative part. I am seeing lots more questions for you. Where are we at, Rob?
So the reason why I was asking David and Ying about their questions is because we can be transcending Kylie's talk now and having an open discussion. But before we do that, our program officer, Sisang Lim, wanted to say a couple of words.
So first, I want to thank everyone. This is a great, the speakers, this is a great start to the workshop. And I want to thank Rob, Myrta, Gautam, and Marina for organizing this workshop. And in particular, Rob, for putting together a very interesting set of ideas and submitting a proposal to the NSF. Now, this workshop is actually a very important part of the program's efforts to explore new and existing conceptions about augmented intelligence. And at the same time, through this format, we hope that we will engage all relevant disciplinary communities to help shape the program's priorities for new research directions. And also in doing so, we hope to build an interdisciplinary community that can come together to create a more integrative science of augmented intelligence. So with that, I just want to have you launch into the more general discussions, and I look forward to continuing to see all of you through the summer and to learn more about, for me also, to learn more about what everybody's interests are in augmented intelligence. Thank you very much. Rob, back to you.
Great. I'm just going to punt it over to David then.
Great, thanks all. And this is a kind of Kylie specific question, so happy to see the floor. But yeah, I'm really intrigued by this idea of a research practice industry partnership. I feel like I have some experience with research industry partnerships, some experience with research practice partnerships. I'm curious to hear a little bit about some of the unique tensions that might emerge from kind of getting those three parties together. My sense, a lot of the tensions I felt is around just timelines in general, that we as academics move at a different pace than, schools and teachers who need something for Monday, and then industry, which is just kind of always kind of moving as fast as they can. So yeah, curious to hear a bit about unique tensions that emerge and how you've managed them.
Yeah, time is a key tension, right? So everybody's working on different timelines, and schools are, I like to think about them as three-ring circuses, right? And so you think you can go on there on Thursday and you can't, and what's happening there. A lot of times I think about trying to advise companies to sort of rebuild the way they work, right? And so we're not just designing the tech, but really, I'm not really trying to find a lifetime partner in which we always work together, but really more in Seth's view of like all these ends of one. So trying to hone our methodologies, hone our approaches, honing our theory so that we can work across these pieces. So, so part of what I want to leave companies with is, how can their customer support really think about what do people need to know in the field to get onboarded? And I'm not really a schools person, so I think more about libraries, I think more about museums, I think more about so this is one of our rare schools projects, but schools are a particular context too. How can they have direct lines of communication, ways in which they're responding, but also kind of training them? Most of them have grown up in the CS world and not in in the education world at all. So they don't even know how to hear the feedback, right? And a lot of times the first gut instinct is like, well, I don't have that bug. That's not a real bug, right? And so really getting them to be patient to hear those things and to really start to hone that work, but also leaving them with tools. I didn't just develop this survey battery to contribute back to the research, but to really kind of advise them on like, how can you start to use these to assess your own rollouts, right? Giving them the tools to do that, giving them, having them, advising them to set up user testing sides of their market. A lot of times ed tech companies do not have this, right? They heard from so-and-so and maybe their funders kind of agreed that this is a real problem and that teachers would love this, right? I mean, that's pretty much all it takes for 99% of the ed tech world to deploy a technology out to the world. And so their user testing is so thin, it's almost non-existent, right? And so what does that actually really mean to do that? Like, and unpacking that, and that's not because they don't want to do it. It's kind of expensive, right? But they have to sort of see that value. So it's little baby steps. We got to work with them to really transform the way they work, but also the technologies that they're creating. And I really believe when we get companies set up with the right processes, they can sort of self-manage themselves, right?
Great, thank you.
Rob, did you? Was Ying? Were you next? Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Seth and Kylie. This is very important topic, and that got me thinking after listening to both of your presentations. We're as a scholar, we're pretty much at the downstream, accepting all the system and designs, and then we do research. My question is, given this big foundation and government support, what can we do upstream? Because when I think about Minecraft, it's pretty much a set of groups, designers design whatever they want, and then everyone else have no choice but accept their design, their norm. They can shape the interactions, shape our behaviors, shape people's decision-making, yet we have no say in that process.
Right. And it's not just you that feels that. Almost every consumer feels it, almost every teacher, educator, kind of nonprofit, you're like, this comes so close. If you just had this feature, I'd love you more, and they don't have great ways to get that feedback. But this is where, as researchers, we have to start to work a little differently. So I'm just going to give you some concrete suggestions because I think they're going to be more receptive than you think. But with the caveat, you're going to have to work a little differently, right? And you can always email me, and I'm happy to advise on what would that look like? But attending conferences, normally we just go to our research conferences. So thinking about where are your industry conferences, right? So I'm happy to say that there's almost no company that I've actually approached that said no. Now, knowing the right office to go to, right? I've never had anybody. Now, right, things like, right when Minecraft is launching and sets its height, that's not the time to go to them to say, hey, can we partner, right? And they might say no if like too many of us start going back to these folks, but go to conferences like ASU, GSV, go to, these kind of industry education, and by education, I mean higher ed kind of spheres. Look for those kinds of things of like, where are people kind of announcing this stuff, and just go up to their booths. And a lot of times, like they're really struggling, right? And their jobs, they don't have the kinds of jobs we have. Their jobs are on the line if they don't deliver a high quality product. That tech company is going to fail, right? But definitely working with smaller startups, getting them to going right. The vast majority of small startups fail in that year. So can you get them on the right track? And maybe, there's also ways to spin your ideas out into its own company, right? So I know a lot of researchers that do that. I don't have two bodies, so I'd rather work with an existing ed tech company that knows their craft and give them my good ideas and see them scale rather than trying to get stuck on patents and scaling and stuff. But there's all sorts of different resources. NSF has also done a lot of things in this space too to support this intersection and to help get ideas out of academia. So it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that's already out there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the follow-up questions is actually for that, Seth, because you talk about how community shape our perception. And I think do you aware any research around how the designers or the company groups, how they being shaped by their own corporate culture, their individual culture, and the community they're in? Because I feel there's a tech community, and many of the things they do, they're not thinking about users. They're just thinking about, oh, I can apply this advanced technology. It's really cool. And the users like, why you gave me that? I would never be able to use that. So any insight would be great.
I can say a couple of things to that. One, the coolest examples, the most exciting examples I've seen of emergent culture in these big games, and cultural variation in these big games is for problems that the designer, the company didn't actually intend, like they didn't expect. So a good example is loot distribution in World of Warcraft. So you'll have 20 people just worked together to beat some big troll, and by the game's design, that troll drops one item, and only one person can get that item. So there's a sort of collective action problem of how do you decide who should get that item? And there's impressive and pretty honestly exciting complexity and variety in the solutions that users have come up with to decide who should get the thing. You see communities showing tremendous variation in cleverness, resourcefulness in solving that problem that immediately gets collapsed away when 5 years down the line, the company that wrote the game decided it's a problem that they should solve. And so they'll come up with a mechanism that kind of replaces and in a way kills all of that beautiful emergence. So I would say to some extent, a lot of the most exciting culture I've seen happen sort of despite companies. And you have to really know the domain and know what the company's blind spots accidentally were to get really good insight into these kind of cultural happenings.
Okay, thank you so much.
I think I'm next. Rob calling on myself. So actually my question follows on Ying's question, I think, because what is obviously conspicuous about the juxtaposition of your two talks is the partnerships with large companies, right? So Seth's work definitely requires Minecraft, and Kylie's been involved in Symphony Classroom. And so I guess, as a cognitive psychologist, firmly ensconced in my comfort zone of laboratory experiments, I guess I'm interested in how the two of you see this new wave of partnering with large infrastructural companies. Do you see it as like replacing laboratory controlled experiments? Kylie had this idea of scaling up. Do you see that as the direction? I think we used to have Mitch Nathan here. I think he's on the call still, and he has some interesting ideas about scaling down. So I just wanted to see, like, what is the right way of combining hygienic lab experiments with these broader, more ambitious enterprises?
My own theory, like it kind of comes from the media studies, is that like, with the new addition of say, every new technology and new platform, it doesn't outmode the last one, right? And so in a similar respect, like we have podcasts and radio still persist, but in kind of a newish way, right? Like, and so you're not going to see existing lines of inquiry. I mean, all of these areas of inquiry are really relatively new, right? All of the social sciences, right? You got cog-sci, laboratory experiences, and so forth. So you're never going to see those go away. I think it's just, how do we take the laboratory insights, right? And I do, I guess I don't do a clean laboratory study, but as close as you can to 90-minute lab studies. And then how do we scale that forward? And so we kind of have to know how we all work together as part of a larger system, in my view. And so like I love in my work that I kind of work on that early start of the spectrum, and I kind of lose interest in the scaling work. I mean, I want it to happen. happen. I think we all publish our papers wanting people to like read them, take the ideas up and run with them. And in reality, they don't. So how do we actually set up systems that do that over time is sort of my interest. I don't know, Seth, what's your view on this?
I see myself having drifted, from proper lab environments to these more like highly designed, highly constrained, but ultimately observational settings. I consider myself a bad experimentalist. So I run bad experiments. I use structure in the environment, structure in these simplified settings to set up little causal inferences or to make as strong of a causal argument as I can get away with lab, think lab, rather than strictly out in the world observational. So it's better than observational. The downside is to the extent my experiments end up being good, and my causation ends up being good, I didn't pick my questions. So I've kind of found that every game that I study or every domain I study when I hop between those domains, it's really good for one question and I don't get to pick it. And it really revolves around what's the goal of that system and how are people accomplishing that goal. So I give up the rights, I give up control over what I'm specifically studying or asking in order to get experiment quality insights or inference out of a given domain. And so for that reason, this is the only right answer. I certainly see these settings as a complement to the lab. The lab's going to be even more artificial, even better controlled. But they are a really nice sweet spot, I think. I think it's underappreciated how much causation we can get out of games and other engineered social systems like classrooms compared to entirely real world environments where you can't make assumptions about what people want or that they're highly motivated to accomplish those things. So, I answered that as a very methodology question with a very methodology answer, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, go ahead, Mitch.
Oh, hi, I really appreciated this. And Rob, thanks for the shout out. I guess the proximal thing, which is this question of scale, is that we often frame scaling up as kind of like moving from these very rigorous, highly construct valid sorts of studies to the messier, more complex world that involves more context, more players, more environmental variability. And the shift in thinking from scale up to scale down is to say that there's merits to starting with the complex system from the beginning, the system and the environment and the context in all its interconnectivities that we want to change. And then identify, to sort of borrow from like Herb Simon kind of lingo, identify these nearly decomposable subsystems where we can do more causal inference type research in order to try to optimize some of the factors that go into the large system. But when we do that and we come up with a conclusion and we offer something that will be a revision, it has a place in the rich interconnected system already because it's drawn from that initially. And it sounds like even in certainly the conversations happening today and really quite a lot of work that goes on for cognitive science research to translate to the real world, we often lose track of that. We do something that Engstrom and Greeno refer to as the factoring assumption. We take the idea that context is just a factor in a regression, if you will, in some model, and it can be added. But if you see context as not factorable, if you see it as literally interconnected to all the components and you approach it with that in mind, then we engage in these attempts to go to scale in very different ways. So that's kind of that thought.
I can yes and that. So, I mean, oh, by the way, I love the birds in your background. It really adds to the context.
Thank you. That's why I have I have my video muted so you're not all jealous of me hanging out outside. I've really been hitting it repeatedly. Let's do as large N for across social systems as we're doing across individuals. But whatever happened to N equals 1 individual unit of analysis research? Essentially, we have the introspection tradition in psychology that kind of died in the first half of the 20th century. But thick description on humans, we have a little bit in like sort of medical therapy, clinical environment when you find a really interesting person, with a really interesting case history, a really interesting combination of things. But I would love to see some kind of augmented intelligence heavy return to the introspectionist tradition in cognitive science, really embracing this sort of complex systems perspective on the individual, that the individual again is embedded in their context and merits this complex systems thick description approach that you're kind of describing, Mitch.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. I think I do think that the complexities of that I mean, within learning sciences, that's kind of our thinking of why we want to design for that local context and all its complexities, rather than having something stripped away that might actually be important there. And part of our tradition too has a rich sort of anthropological tradition and kind of working within those design contexts similar to what Seth is looking at as well. So that's really cool. Thank you, Mitch, for all those observations. Catherine, let's go ahead and get to your question before we run out of time.
Yeah, hi, Kylie. Thanks for the great talk. And Rob and Mitch, nice to see you again. I did almost come to work with both of you in years gone by. So no worries if you don't remember me, Rob, but Mitch, I almost came to postdoc for you. So nice to see you again. So Kylie, thank you. Well articulated. I came up in this world with most of you all, but in my professional career, I've gone on and worked both on research practitioner partnerships and now also research industry partnerships. And so Kylie, really well done on very succinctly articulating that space and describing the main problems of practice and just all of the complexity and realities that we have to deal with being an applied learning scientist working at this nexus. It's not easy work, but I like to think it's well worth it. So I've got a lot of thoughts here. Kylie, I really resonated well with how you said it's all about changing the ways of working. So I'm currently situated as a learning scientist at Pearson, which is a global education company. And we are an internal set of experts. We're almost the internal, expert consultants. So it's our job to act, Kylie, as you do, to advise on learning sciences research, but we are situated within that complex system of how to embed in the ways of work. And what we found most success with is precisely what you've said, is embedding this the ways of the evidence into that way of working, right? So it's like, let's take evidence, let's test, let's iterate. So that design-based research cycle, which someone noted, does dovetail very nicely with the agile cycle. Now, a couple things I've found work in terms of making this space between all of us more productive. I found that a couple things like really, really help, right? One is for us as academics to provide really like actionable research. Like if you just come back and say, well, it depends, you are going to lose people immediately. And so Rob, I appreciate the work that you and your colleagues, Emily Fife and Ben Mopes, are doing on the many classrooms feedback work, because that's work that I can pick up and turn around and say, see, look, we tried it across all of these places and this is a definitive answer. So I really appreciate how the academic field is moving towards kind of wider scale research that makes it easier for us who love and value this work to show its value and to say, hey, this is what we should be doing, right? So I see that movement in the academic field, keep doing it. And now, Kylie, you also spoke about frameworks, and a lot of our work is building kind of frameworks that make it easy to understand, showcase the business value. But I mean, we're all here to help people learn. So that's not so hard. That's not a hard thing to sell, right? We're all on the same page about that, but we do have to showcase that. And that's where kind of building frameworks help. Jeremy Rochelle of Digital Promise wrote a nice piece at ICLS last year on like learning sciences modeling, which I think is a really underappreciated aspect of being a learning scientist, where it's like, how do we articulate this complex system within Minecraft or within a classroom in a way that captures enough of the complexity, but simplifies it such that we can actually get our hooks in it and work with it. And that is an art and a science. And so as much as we can kind of put forward models on that front, I think will just help us solve all of our collective problems together. So much to talk about. I don't even know where to go next, but I just really appreciate holding this space for all of us to come together, because we're all trying to solve the same things, but we just come at it from different angles. So as much as we can understand and talk each other's language and make that translation process easier, the better. So thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I omitted that, like, a lot of companies are starting kind of their own research firms within the company. So, you know, a lot of folks are at Apple or Microsoft Research or other spaces as well too. And they've been in Pearson and, you know, pilfering out all of our learning scientists into these spaces. So thank you for that reminder too. And Seth, you were gonna maybe close. You've got maybe something on the self-governance.
I guess, yeah, to circle back, there was a question about self-governance kids classrooms. Oh, I just wrote it, but I keep a collection of as many examples of kids self-governance as I can find, and they're pretty good at it. But when it fails, it tends to be not tremendously different than when adults fail. We're all pretty bad at it, and most self-governing communities fail to succeed at building something that works for everybody. But the successes are super inspiring, as even more so for kids than adults, because it seems like harder. But they're especially watching videos, just so wow, they're really good at it. So I'm a big fan. I'll share links if I can dig up a bunch. But doing it in the classroom, I have no idea how to pull that off. I think there's experimental pedagogy that's focused on letting kids really make decisions about their own education as a group. But I know nothing about that, and so certainly nothing on the quantitative side where I lean.
Very cool. Well, yes, definitely, as Marina's encouraging us, I'd love to, anybody who still wants to talk RPIPs, or if you're doing any type of educational innovation, even if it's kind of tangential. I don't even know, Seth, if you would have thought your stuff was under that umbrella, but I'd love to kind of have those names and recommendations, and I'd be happy to follow up by phone, or think there's spaces to talk to. Be great.
Great. So thanks for a great session. I just want to point to my co-organizers to see if there's something that I was negligent in pointing out. So Myrta snuck in. She's here and she's going to be moderating next week. And Marina, I totally was remiss in anything having to do with Jamboards. I wasn't looking at Jamboards. Is anything going on?
Yeah, there are some thoughts there, but people can look at it later and continue the discussion if they want.
Great. So thanks so much, everybody, for your participation.